So, if the second industrial revolution is peanut butter, then just think of the capitalist revolution as jelly. And when you put them together, they make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, except this is a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that will probably give you tuberculosis because, ha, we're in the Industrial Revolution. Anyway, separate peanut butter and jelly are, let's say, not as impressive as when you throw them together unless you really hate peanut butter and jelly. So think of that as the relationship between capitalism and industrialization. We usually find them together, and when they are together, let's say that they become more powerful. They feed into each other. You kind of have this feedback loop going on, and we'll talk about what that looks like in just a second, actually. But we also need to explain where what capitalism really is. And we've mentioned Adam Smith and the idea of capitalism. And remember that all capitalism really is the idea that the means of production, the stuff that produces wealth in society, factories, businesses, whatever, is going to be held in private rather than public hands. And remember that throughout most of human history, one of the fringe benefits, one of the perks to being in charge is having control of the means of production. You don't have to be Joseph Stalin to really fit into this category. You could be James the First, for example, one of the major signatories and shareholders of one of the innumerable joint stock companies that we talked about in the beginning of the course. And we talked about the fact that, to be a noble back in the day, not only meant that you had to jump on a horse in shiny armor and give military service to the monarch, it also meant that you were guaranteed control of land, which was back in the day the thing that produced wealth. Also, being a noble meant that you were not just an economic elite, but a political elite. But what begins to happen is that starting in the late Middle Ages, approximately, you see the growth of this non-land-owning merchant class, and they begin to basically become wealthy not because of property, but because of the financial system. And this wealth grows and grows and grows, and of course, it's a development that we associate with the development of the American colonies as a whole. But we also talked about the fact that this time period was a time period that we associated with mercantilism, where the British government, but also just European governments in general, would pass laws and policies that would mandate where goods could be sold, what price they could be sold for, the extent to which these goods would be taxed. And this is obviously something that, on a political level, really frustrated the colonies. But Adam Smith, who was a Scottish philosopher who published his very famous work, The Wealth of Nations, the same year the Declaration of Independence was signed, didn't really look at what was going on in the colonies from a moral or political level. He was more looking at mercantilism from an economic level. And from his perspective, the idea of the government intervening in the economy was dumb. Now, the reason he said it was dumb is that Smith sort of thought that economic transactions really boils down to the marketplace. And really what we mean by the marketplace is that you have a good or product, and then you have somebody who is interested in buying that good or product. And the price of a good or product is going to be based around demand. And so the idea is that if you have a product that is useful and is in low supply, then that enables the price of that item, or that's going to be that the price of that item is quite high. If there is a lot of that item and there's what we would call low scarcity, then the price of that item is going to be pretty low because the demand will be low because there's excess of this item. It's the good old-fashioned supply and demand curve. But this is something that's kind of, let's say, a fundamental principle of capitalism. Smith thought that when the government stepped in and somehow interfered with that basic relationship of supply and demand, you create inefficiencies. And to kind of spell out what that looks like, let me tell you about a story that certainly does not involve me, from the ancient past, that involves somebody's parents stepping in and taking away a certain video game because maybe somebody was playing that game a bit too much. It may have been The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, a game from the ancient past. But anyway, this person, who was not me, had that game taken away, and the parents involved were going to sell that game somehow, some way. And of course, what happens is that the parents involved sell the game for much, much less than it was actually worth. And to me, that game was to that person, that game was priceless, right? And so I would, if I had to sell it, or if this person had to sell it, at the time, that person certainly wouldn't have let it go for less than $50 or something. But the parents were just, wanted to get rid of it. And so they were thinking about, $10, $15. And from this person's perspective, not only was it sad that the game was being sold, it was even more tragic that it was being sold for much less than its value. And so what Smith's point would be about The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, or maybe less importantly, economics in general, is the fact that when governments intervene in these kind of relationships, governments are having to make value judgments about what other people might be willing to pay for certain items. And the government's not omniscient. I don't think that the parents involved knew how valuable The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess was to this person. And similarly, the government doesn't know how valuable or what the demand is for certain items. So according to Smith, instead, what should happen is that the invisible hand of the marketplace should set prices and not be regulated by government. So this is an idea that sort of begins in the late 18th century, but it's not as if the patriots during the American Revolution were, as they were dodging bullets, were going, hey, did you read that Adam Smith guy? Boy, he has a fascinating treatise on, obviously, at that point, they weren't really thinking in those terms. So instead, like most economic philosophies, it sort of takes a while to sort of take hold in the United States. But once it does, and especially once it sort of converts the business class, it starts to make a significant impact. Laissez-faire capitalism is an economic system in which the government refrains from intervening in private economic transactions. Yes, I know, you can read, good job, but let's talk about maybe a friction here. And I know that the Brands reading last week sort of talks about this in some detail, but think about this. Capitalism means that the means of production, the things that produce wealth, are going to be held by private individuals, businesses, in other words. And laissez-faire capitalism says that governments shouldn't do anything to regulate those businesses, at least as little as possible. So what this means is that if money is power, and you don't have to be a student of Machiavelli to agree with that point, then you can kind of see what's coming. It means that as corporations and businesses become much more powerful, much wealthier, they're going to obtain a certain degree of political power that's going to be hard for the government to regulate. The problem for corporations during the 19th century, though, is that they couldn't get too large or powerful. Partially, that's a result of communication as it existed back in the day. If you think about what it takes to run a major corporation today, especially corporations that are international, that do business all over the world, it requires instantaneous or nearly instantaneous ways to communicate. Like, for example, the internet, telephones, that kind of thing. In other words, all the technology that doesn't exist during the 19th century. So what it means is that if you're a really large corporation during the 19th century, you're probably just based in one state, and you don't really number more than about 100 or so people. That's what it meant to be a large corporation then. That all changes, though, with the Gilded Age, because suddenly transportation technology, communication technology gets better, more efficient. Case in point, the steam engine, the railroad, and of course, the telegraph. And it's interesting that the first robber baron in U.S. history, Cornelius Vanderbilt, is somebody who specialized in both the steamship industry and eventually branches out into the railroads. And that actually is what's going to lead us into our major topic for today. That is the significance of the railroad, because it's really the railroads that become the first large-scale corporations in U.S. history. Actually, the first major corporations in the world. Basically, if you take anything from this lecture, it is the fact that modern-day corporations are shaped in the railroad's image. Everything from how corporations are run to essentially how they manage people and costs, all of that comes from America's experience with expanding the railroads from Atlantic to Pacific. So, 3 a.m., I know this site looks familiar. You're thinking, this is what your eyes look like after the end of an all-nighter. And it's not really wrong. I can see the resemblance, but in actual fact, this is a map showcasing basically the layout of the nation's railroad networks. Railroad expansion picked up at an extraordinary pace. And for some of you, that might seem familiar. You're like, well, Mr. Dry, you kind of told us that during the American Civil War, the Union, and to a lesser extent the Confederacy, decided to expand the railroads in order to better achieve military victory. And that's true. But it doesn't end with the Civil War. So by 1865, there's something like 35,000 miles of railroad in the United States. By 1900, you're looking at around 193,000 miles. So basically, you have a seven-fold increase in just about 35 years. And the question is, well, where does all that come from? And there's a couple of different answers here, and they're really interesting answers. So you have an interesting contradiction. We talked about the fact that this is the time period of laissez-faire capitalism. Thank you, Adam Smith. This time period in which businesses are supposed to sort of thrive on their own, and the invisible hand of the market is supposed to guide economic transactions. But in actual fact, the railroads owe their significance partially to the federal government. So the federal government, if you remember, thinks of the railroad as not just a worthwhile investment, but as a military necessity during the Civil War. Remember that in 1862, during the very beginning of the Civil War, the federal government passes the Union Pacific Railroad Act. This is the act which enables the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. And as you can see, a bunch of other railroads as well. But what does that mean for the government to authorize a transcontinental railroad? Well, the government, the federal government in this case, decides to incentivize railroad companies that are owned privately to build railroad lines by basically giving them a stipend. And basically, this stipend would involve paying a certain amount of money for every additional mile of railroad constructed. And they would even vary the stipend based upon the terrain. So, for example, building a railroad line across mountainous, rugged terrain would actually net more money than building it on flat terrain. I can't remember the numbers involved, but I seem to remember that it was like $500 or $1,000 for every mile of railroad constructed. It's not an extraordinary amount of money, but it's still the federal government sort of adopting that Hamiltonian idea, and really also just the American systems philosophy that railroads and infrastructure are something that the federal government should support. But the federal government has one other advantage. If you remember your Louisiana Purchase, and I hope you all do, you may remember that land purchased by the government was held and later sold to private individuals. And this, during a time period before an income tax, was a good way for the federal government to gain revenue. And remember that the government would also sell that land for fairly cheap prices. So theoretically, everyone was happy. Individuals are happy. The government is happy. But then the question is, well, what's going to happen to all this land in the Midwest? And remember that during the American Civil War, this is very important, so I'll go ahead and take note of this if you haven't already. The Lincoln administration passes what is called the Homestead Act in 1862. The Homestead Act basically awards land to private individuals for $5. And if they farm that land continuously for 5 years, they actually don't even have to pay that $5. Now, the federal government gave out a lot of land under the Homestead Act. The federal government gave out even more land to railroad companies. So over 170 million acres of land, yet 3 times more land that is given to individuals under the Homestead Act is given to railroad companies. And it's even more generous than that, because the question is, well, what if somebody has a little house out here on the prairie and it's basically standing right in the middle of where a railroad line is supposed to go? What do you do if you're a railroad company then? Well, that's when you basically get the federal government to step in and side with you. Against a private individual. You get the federal government to exercise what's called the takings clause, the part of the Fifth Amendment that allows the federal government to confiscate the property of individuals, and then the government transfers that land from the individual to the railroad company. Now, think about this definition. Laissez-faire capitalism, an economic system in which the government refrains from intervening in private economic transactions. Now, the thing is that the federal government in the Gilded Age doesn't just refuse to intervene in the private sector. It actively champions the private sector. It actually prioritizes the private sector in many instances over the interests and needs of the individuals. But partially this was also because the railroads were seen as vital to the country's future, the country's national security, and also remember that if you remember your Credit Mobilier scandal, there was a close relationship between the federal government and these railroad companies. Now, let's talk a little bit about what the railroad companies give us. So, if you're going to build that much stuff, believe it or not, even with federal government stipends, the federal government giving you land, it's just not enough. Railroads are inherently expensive. And if you think about it, um, the fact that railroads are expensive might seem a little unintuitive because if you have a transcontinental railroad, um, basically, if you're the only game in town, that's almost like having your own printed, like mint for all intents and purposes, right? Um, but think about what it means to be a railroad company. Something like the Transcontinental Railroad took years to develop, and in that time, you're not making any money. You're also, by the way, having to employ literal armies of workers. During this time period, you had hundreds of thousands of railroad workers who would travel throughout the West, working on the railroad lines. So you're talking about a lot of upfront costs without necessarily a guarantee of return, a likelihood of return, but no guarantee of return. So there's a lot of risk there. And so much risk, in fact, that even if you and a lot of your friends get together and finance it and you're independently wealthy, it's not going to be enough. Hence the significance of the stock market. So the stock market is what allow the railroad companies to become so large and so powerful. Remember that a stock market is basically a market on which corporations can basically publicly trade um, ownership shares. And the idea is that if you're an individual and you buy stock, um, on the one hand, that entitles you to receive dividends that are based on basically a percentage of a corporation's profits. So you get some money. You also get certain ownership and voting rights. So if you own, let's say, 1% of a corporation's outstanding stock, then theoretically you control 1% of all votes. And remember, if you think about this system of corporate management, the Brands reading talked about the fact that capitalism and democracy are kind of antithetical because democracy is based on the idea that all people are equal. One person, one vote. Well, this is one of those instances, by the way, where you see that, capitalism, for better or for worse, is based on a system of inequality to a certain extent. So, anyway, more on that in a second. If you look at the stock market, um, the stock market is what allows for these railroad companies to expand without being just destroyed by the enormous upfront costs. Now, of course, any investment in the stock market involves some degree of risk. Um, so the question is, if you're a railroad company, how can you make investors basically feel like they're not really risking anything at all? And to that end, railroad companies experiment with different ways of making investors feel confident that when they buy stock in railroad companies, that it's a good investment. So what railroad companies start doing is they start basically keeping very careful tabs on how much money they make, but also how much money they're spending on things like salaries, how much money they're spending on construction equipment. In other words, railroad companies basically become very good at keeping track of how much money they're spending. And this leads to railroad companies becoming sort of the pioneers in modern day accounting practices. Most corporations had no idea how much money they were spending at any given time. I know that sounds really ridiculous, but it's true. Railroad companies actually established generally accepted accounting principles. I know that's like the super exciting part of the course, right? We talk about the history of accounting, but it's really important because basically the things that railroad companies do here are the things that all modern day corporations do. They also, the thing is with railroads, of course, is that Not only are they highly dependent upon the stock market, if you think about what a railroad company involves, it basically requires a company that can not just administer a business within a state, but between states. That's what makes a railroad company profitable, is the fact that you could basically control an interconnected railroad line from one end of the country to another. So that's where the telegraph comes in, but it also leads to something else. And that is that if you think about the way people worked before the 19th century, before the mid 19th century, um, even if you're looking at big companies, most workers at a big company only had one boss, the owner. And everybody knew who the boss was. It was a fairly simplistic hierarchical system. But that all changes as railroads become not just large state-based corporations, but national corporations. Because suddenly, like, if let's say that you have a railroad company headquartered in New York, well, you can't tell all your people in, Nebraska and Kansas and Missouri what to do. That's an insane amount of micromanagement. So what happens is that it requires the manager to pick basically assistant managers or middle managers, management professionals that can manage different branches of railroad companies. And the thing is, of course, that modern corporations basically adopt this model. So not only do you have a boss in if you're a railroad worker, but your boss has a boss. Um, Remember that fundamental conflict that we talked about between capitalism and democracy. Democracy is about people being equal. But one of the things that happens is that as the country industrializes, as railroad companies start expanding and becoming more powerful and more wealthy, you start to see the country become more hierarchical in some respects, where suddenly people have bosses. And if you're a farmer, with your own land, you don't have a boss. You are the boss. If you fire yourself, you're doing something wrong as a farmer. But remember that with the Industrial Revolution, suddenly you have a boss, your boss is a boss, and maybe your boss's boss, maybe they have a boss. So you get this system where nobody really knows who's in charge of what. And at the top of the pyramid, you have the CEO. Well, the CEO, though, is the chief executive officer or the president, whoever you're talking about. They're usually hired by the stockholders. Who are the stockholders? All of us. And who are we? Well, we're ordinary people. Some of us work for the railroad company. Yeah, it's confusing. Nobody really knows who's in charge of who anymore, which is one of the other sort of contradictions with the Industrial Revolution. Gradually, as the 19th century goes on, the railroad companies give us one other thing: the creation of a national market. Now, a national market means that you have a marketplace in which all parts of the country are interconnected and participate. In practice, what this means is that you're buying a lot of the same stuff wherever you are. This is actually kind of a new thing. And if you think about it, I know I've said this beforehand, but it's amazing how much culture sometimes revolves around the things we consume, whether that's Starbucks coffee, or it's, for example, whether you have an iPhone or an Android phone, a lot of who we are and a lot of, you know, our personality and our ability to talk to other people is based around the things that we consume. And if you are somebody who's going from one end of the country to another, you can guarantee that you're going to see the same fast food restaurants and overpasses. You're going to run into the same department stores. And people just didn't have that same guarantee during the 19th century until you begin to see a growth in the national market. And you see that specifically with the development of Sears and Roebuck, which is really sad because Sears and Roebuck, as you can kind of see, well, they're sort of on their last legs. They've been on their last legs since I've been teaching, and even before that. But the fact is that Sears back in the day was a much bigger deal than they are now. So Sears is all about this mail order catalog. It allowed you to buy from a series of listings certain standardized products, and they would be shipped to your house along the railroad lines. Whether your house was in New York City or Promontory Point, Utah, you could buy anything from tools to houses to pets, basically anything that you could think that you could want to buy, whether it's legal or illegal today, you could buy in a Sears catalog. Um, so what this kind of means is that the Amazon business model was really created by Sears and Roebuck. Amazon's kind of perfected it and has, let's say, increased the scale and made it so that you're not dependent upon trains so much as like contract drivers and that kind of thing. But you have the same basic business model that you can buy from a standardized list of products and get those products delivered anywhere in the country. Railroad companies don't just give you a standardized list of products. In addition to that, the railroad companies give you time. And I kind of mean that literally. Railroad companies are the ones who basically establish modern day American time zones. Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific time zones. Those are all devised in 1883, basically as a way to maximize railroad efficiency. The railroad companies, because they're so concerned with profitability, actually adopt what's called scientific management, or Taylorism, as it's sometimes called. This kind of philosophy and management style that tries to establish basically like the principles of workplace psychology, what motivates people, how to maximize, worker efficiency, and of course, what happens is that the establishment of the railroads encourages mass migration, particularly immigrants from newer countries, or at least countries that we haven't really talked about in great length yet. China. Chinese laborers were employed particularly by Leland Stanford out of the West to build railroads. And Stanford's strategy was not unlike the Lowell family in Massachusetts. The idea is you hire workers who are marginalized and you pay them less than what other people would be willing to accept. And by the way, because of this, this kind of, this will eventually sort of lead to a backlash against Chinese laborers, which will lead to what's called the Chinese Exclusion Act that we'll talk about a little bit later. So we've talked about Vanderbilt and we've talked about the railroad companies. And remember that the railroad companies are, there's no one national railroad company. Okay, they're large. They're actually enormous corporations, but there's never this moment in which one person or one company controls all the railroad companies in the United States. We come pretty close. There's an episode in the early 20th century where that almost happens. But by and large, railroad companies were so big that there couldn't be one single railroad company. What we're going to talk about next is we're going to talk about companies of a very different kind. I know that the Brands reading has talked a lot about robber barons or the captains of industry. Uh, Basically, during the Civil War and the post-Civil War era, we see the emergence of this sort of super rich capitalist class. And the very word you use to describe these individuals is political in and of itself. A captain of industry is somebody who seems kind of admirable. A robber baron, on the other hand, is a term that's used for old sort of German barons who would kidnap passerbys and hold them for ransom. So you get two very sort of distinct views of who the robber barons are. But basically, we sort of think of the robber barons as industrialists or big business owners who gained huge profits by paying their employees extremely low wages. That's the official sort of APUSH definition. And typically, we also associate robber barons with the creation of trusts. These are entities that are basically created to hold multiple companies and run them on behalf of a single individual. Basically, a trust is the legal mechanism by which robber barons could create monopolies. Now, by 1900, basically 10% of the US population controls something like 90% of all wealth. And that's kind of where I can hear you start to gasp behind the screen, maybe. But it's also worth noting that, remember, we said that history is in the present. And we talked about some of the reasons why the Gilded Age is, a topic of discussion today. And one of the reasons for that is that in 2016, the wealthiest 10% don't control 90% of all wealth, but they do control about 76% of all wealth. So the politics and economics of the Gilded Age isn't really too far distant from our own. The robber barons are still controversial today as a group because, to a certain extent, they harken back to the reason the country was first settled by Europeans, and that is to achieve upward mobility and riches and wealth. And it's also for that reason that the Gilded Age is kind of associated with the rags to riches stories. You should kind of take note of that. The rags to riches stories were stories written by Horatio Alger, and they typically featured, young protagonists who started from nothing and eventually, through hard work and education, end with something. But that being said, the robber barons are variously classified as being sort of representatives of being of achieving upward mobility, but they're also kind of characterized as being tyrannical to a certain extent. People who sort of exploit anybody and anything who's exploitable. We associate them with strike busting, with child labor, with unsafe working conditions. And it's kind of hard to get a sense of whether or not the robber barons, or well, let's say who the robber barons really are in U.S. history. Because on the one hand, we see that if you look at the economy as a whole, you see growth in terms of wages, and you see growth in gross domestic product. So in other words, if you look at the average wages during this time period, and if you look at the gross domestic product as a whole, you do see increases. You see the beginning of this, significant increase in wealth that really begins around the time of the Civil War. But that being said, that's not the entire story. While people are getting wealthier, and while even workers are getting wealthier, and that's something that we can kind of lose track of, is the fact that workers are leaving the farms for a reason. But it's the reason why there's very often a backlash against the robber barons, and why we sometimes think of the robber barons as sort of living in this sort of Charles Dickensonian dystopia, is the fact that as people are getting wealthier, uh, they're also giving stuff up. So, for example, on the farm, you could be your own boss. You could sort of regulate your own time throughout the day. Um, in this new sort of industrial era where you're working for, these large corporations, trust companies, that kind of thing, um, it's not uncommon to basically live by the clock. And sometimes you're working for as much as 59 hours per week. By the way, you're considered working full time if you're working 40 hours a week today. And in certain industries, workers actually had to labor even longer. So the average steel worker would work something like 12 hours a day for very often 7 days a week. That's, for those of you who can't math quickly, that's 84 hours a week. Um, so from 1860 to 1890, wages increase an average of 50%. And your hourly wage was about $3.50, which wasn't bad for the time period. But on the flip side, in 1913, there were over 25,000 deaths among factory workers on the job, and over 700,000 injuries. Now, today, the way we take care of that is with workman's comp, that you get injured on the job and you get compensated for it. Well, not during this time period. If you got injured on the job, well, sucks to be you. Maybe your community would take care of you, maybe a church or religious organization, maybe your family, and maybe if your boss was a gentle soul, maybe they could, throw in a few bucks and sort of speed along your recovery. But the thing is that you were always one wrong step from being out of work permanently. So this is, I think, one of the interesting and maybe not commonly seen pictures that we get from the Gilded Age, which is it's not that people are necessarily getting poorer, it's that people are getting wealthier, but there's a significant cost involved. There's a lot of risk, and you also see people's sort of standard of living and health to a certain extent take a hit in exchange for this increase in personal wealth. So, that being said, let's go over some of these robber barons and their the companies that they created. This is John D. Rockefeller, by the way. So I know you guys read about him in the Brands reading. John D. Rockefeller is the person who basically creates the modern day oil industry. John D. Rockefeller was somebody who basically is born into an obscure family in New York. Again, he's basically raised by his mother. Was widely noted in school for being boring, dour, not particularly interesting, but apparently he was that person who was just hyper focused all the time. And Rockefeller was that person who got into the oil industry in the United States when it was still sort of burgeoning and growing. And he wasn't necessarily like the most creative individual. Instead, John D. Rockefeller was this really lame person who would go to bed trying to figure out how he could get his gas canisters down in price another half a cent. He was constantly looking for ways to reduce costs. And as a consequence, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Corporation, far from being universally loathed or reviled, was actually kind of universally loved, at least at first, because it was a company that distributed cheap oil and gas that would allow people to light their homes. If you're a consumer, John D. Rockefeller is the guy who brought light to your house, quite literally, yeah, in fact. Um, and so Rockefeller essentially becomes wealthy, not because he's necessarily, a famous inventor like Edison. Instead, it's because he takes a basic product and he reduces it in price and makes it so efficient and so cost effective that he drives his competitors out of business. And some people, especially the competition, would say that he did that too well. And in fact, John D. Rockefeller was exceptional at basically buying out his competition. Many of those competitors are very bitter about the fact that their oil refineries are being bought out by Rockefeller. And one of them, an individual by the name of Ida Tarbell, whose father was actually a president of an oil company bought out by Rockefeller, will actually get revenge against Rockefeller and his Standard Oil Corporation. But basically, the way Rockefeller's um, monopoly is created is through this process called horizontal integration. Basically, it means that you are the only company that manufactures or deals with this product. Now, again, you guys have probably heard me say that Standard Oil not only became the largest oil company in the United States, it became the largest oil company in the world. It comprised about 90% of U.S. oil production and 60% of global oil production. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company seemed like, if this doesn't sort of drive the idea home, it seemed like a monster. And in some respects, you can kind of think of Rockefeller as being like the Jeff Bezos or the Bill Gates of his day. This corporate tycoon whose company is just growing unimaginably. However, if you want a very different robber baron, you can look at this guy who looks like Santa Claus, whose name is Andrew Carnegie, or Andrew Carnegie. Uh, if you're trying to find that rags to riches story from the Gilded Age, Andrew Carnegie, or Carnegie, isn't a bad pick. Carnegie was somebody whose parents basically immigrated from Scotland in the 1840s. He comes to the United States. He gets work as um, basically a shoe shine boy, kind of like the rags to riches stories. And eventually, he's able to get a job at a railroad company right before the Civil War. And another thing that's interesting, by the way, is that Carnegie goes back to school, to night school, and learns how to operate one of Samuel Morse's telegraphs. He learns Morse code. And the thing is, working on the railroad, he also gets to basically transmit messages from his employers, from his employers to the New York stock market, and he learned basically the types of stock his bosses were buying. And let's say that Carnegie took that information and used his meager savings, and he bought some of those same stocks, which means that Carnegie does sort of come from nothing, but he also gets a few lucky breaks, and he gets rich first and foremost because of the stock market more than anything else. Now, Carnegie actually masses a small fortune during the Civil War and eventually creates a steel company concentrated around Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania today. And eventually, the company that Carnegie founds will eventually become U.S. Steel in the early 20th century once Carnegie retires. Now, you probably have heard Carnegie's name before. And maybe some of you have heard of the name Andrew Carnegie, but probably a lot of you have heard of, for example, the Carnegie Endowment of the Arts or the Carnegie Foundation. And this is because Carnegie was somebody who kind of fashioned himself as the cool robber baron. He actually spends a lot of his personal fortune trying to kind of, you know, get people to like him and appreciate him. And to a certain extent, this is something that that society sort of benefits from. Carnegie actually founds over 3,000 libraries in the United States. And of course, we have Carnegie Mellon University, this university that Carnegie founds because he's always he's passionate about education. He understands what going back to school did for him, and he wants to sort of pay that experience forward. He fashions himself, like I said, as the cool kind of artistic robber baron. He's not that person who's trying to build like a one big super corporation like Rockefeller. What he's trying to do is to create one super efficient corporation that can outcompete all other corporations without becoming too big. And he does this through what's called vertical integration. With vertical integration, you're not buying out other steel mills exactly. What's happening is that you're making sure that basically your entire company is self-sufficient. And this is kind of the Walmart model, where if you're Walmart, you have a monopoly to a certain extent because not only do you have, let's say, you basically specialize in all kinds of products, whether it's groceries or just home commodities or whatever. You also have an advantage in the sense that you own the warehouses, you own the trucks that bring goods to market. You basically are entirely self-sufficient, which means that your costs are actually much less than those of your competitor. Again, Carnegie fashions himself as the cool robber baron. We're going to see, however, one of the worst strikes in U.S. history in our next lesson, and we'll also kind of get a sense of how Carnegie's reputation is kind of affected by that. Now, last but not least, we have John Pierpont Morgan, or J.P. Morgan. So you can tell a lot about J.P. Morgan by the name that he actually preferred to be called. You're not John, you're not J.P., you are Pierpont. Pierpont Morgan. Pierpont Morgan is maybe the one robber baron that doesn't come from nothing. I mean, Carnegie's family is basically born into poverty. And Rockefeller's family, they're not like dirt poor exactly, but he does come from let's say, a non-traditional family for 19th century America. So, and by the way, Vanderbilt himself came from fairly modest means as well. Pierpont Morgan, though, had parents who were fairly wealthy, not as wealthy as he would become, but fairly wealthy. But really, Pierpont Morgan, if you actually look and see what he specialized in, Pierpont Morgan didn't specialize in like a product like Carnegie did with steel, or Rockefeller did with oil, or Vanderbilt did with the steamship and railroad industries. Pierpont Morgan was, if you think of him as having a monopoly, think of him as being the face or the leader of the financial sector. Basically, Pierpont developed the reputation for being a very canny investor. And the Brands reading talks about this, that he just sort of had a knack for understanding what goods were worth. And so what happens is that if Pierpont Morgan bought stock, you had better buy the same stock. If Pierpont Morgan sold, you were well advised to sell. And this credibility, this power, allows him to, in some ways, exert his power and influence even over sitting American presidents. We'll talk about these. A couple of events in the 1890s and early 1900s where the federal government is actually forced to ask Pierpont Morgan for a bailout because only he commands enough influence on Wall Street that he could get private investors to loan the federal government money. I also have to point out my favorite Pierpont Morgan story, because if you look at Morgan, he was a big guy and he loved being intimidating. But you also see, let's just say that Morgan did not look like this. He was very self-conscious about his nose. Apparently, he suffered from some kind of skin disease on his nose, and the result is that this nose was like purple and pimply, and of course, it's the first thing that most people would notice, but people were well advised to simply ignore it. So, at one point, Pierpont Morgan is having tea with a friend. And this friend has a young, precocious daughter. And as Morgan comes in and the friend is ready to serve tea, the daughter is kind of in the kitchen. And of course, as kids do, she points and says, "Mommy, look it." And at that point, the friend is horrified. And she covers her daughter's mouth and says, "Now, don't you talk about it? Don't you point at it? Don't you even look at it? Don't even think about it. Just whatever you do, ignore Mr. Morgan and his nose." And so, with a humph, she walks into the next room with a tray serving tea. She sets it down in front of Morgan and she says, "Now, Mr. Morgan, would you like one lump of sugar or two with your nose?" I don't know that we ever figure out what happened after that. Probably nothing good. But Morgan was very touchy about this, which is kind of funny considering just how touchy he was for such a powerful individual. Morgan's power was such that it was said that Morgan was more influential and powerful than the President of the United States, at least until Theodore Roosevelt, which might suggest why Theodore Roosevelt himself is so powerful and significant. What's also really interesting, though, is that if you were to ask Morgan and Carnegie who their idols were, they would both say Napoleon Bonaparte. They both saw themselves as conquerors, but conquerors in the boardroom and conquerors who basically conquered through financial acquisitions rather than big pitched battles. It gives you some idea as to their mentality. Now, that being said, the fact is that all of these robber barons were able to sort of amass a large fortune. And the question is, how do you justify that? Because you're not just saying that these individuals were marginally more wealthy than their peers. If you're somebody like John D. Rockefeller, you are personally wealthier than entire countries. How do you make sense of that? And there are a couple of different philosophies that emerge. One is a philosophy called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is this philosophy championed by Herbert Spencer, among others, that basically believes that capitalism and the free market is basically the law of the jungle. And the law of the jungle states that basically the species that is fittest is the species that has been selected for survival. Social Darwinism is essentially the application of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection to the economic realm. It's not the most cuddly economic perspective around, but social Darwinism was very popular, not just in economic circles, but among political circles as well. But again, social Darwinism isn't a moral philosophy. A T Rex isn't fit to survive and doesn't just, gobble up its lesser organisms, lesser dinosaurs, because it's somehow, more moral. It's just bigger and more powerful, right? So social Darwinism is not a moral philosophy. It doesn't even it doesn't even make a pretense that it's a moral philosophy. If that's not your cup of tea, then maybe you like the rags to riches stories. That if you're well educated, or if you're educated and hardworking and all that, you too can one day be a robber baron. But maybe you don't believe that. Maybe you're skeptical about that. Because even though we do know that there are rags to riches stories, a lot of those rags to riches stories were only possible because of intervening luck and other factors. The other perspective is, at least for me, is interesting because it's actually articulated by a robber baron himself, Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie writes an essay in the magazine Wealth, in which he articulates basically the role of the person of wealth. I want you to read this, and I think that I actually ask you guys to source it in your portfolio. But basically, I'll summarize this for you. Carnegie believes that with great power comes great responsibility, that the person of wealth is supposed to use their superior judgment to manage their business, provide employment, and to be a good steward of wealth to both their employees and the next generation. But it's the employees, though, that are the winners and the losers of the Gilded Age. And next time, we're going to talk about the pushback.